Hello, and welcome to this Core Beginners class. This webinar is for those of you who have just been certified in one of our tests, or perhaps have returned to using our tests after some time and feel the need for a refresher. So, it's more of a basic walkthrough, you could say. But let's get started. Today we'll cover the following: what we measure with Core and what type of test design it has. This can be important for you to know. What norm groups and languages we have available. We'll also talk a bit about core job analysis and criteria, how to create them in the easiest way. And finally, we'll cover reports and the test interview at the end. But let's start with what Core is and what it measures. Core is a logical test, but as with many things, there are various names for it. Some people refer to it as a cognitive ability test, others as an aptitude test, an intelligence test, or a problem-solving test. There are so many names. We've settled on logical test because it seems to be the most widely accepted term and the simplest way to explain what it's about. We measure against something called the G-factor theory, or G, or GMA. And GMA stands for General Mental Ability. It's a fairly old and well-researched theory that demonstrates that we have an ability that helps us think logically, recognize patterns, learn new things, and so on. This ability varies from person to person. We measure G using so-called spatial questions, or matrix questions, as they're also known as. These questions consist of figures and therefore contain no written text. This ability is something we are born with and is fully developed between the ages of 20 and 25. It's not an acquired knowledge or skill that we use, rather it's what we often call the trailer of the brain, the underlying capacity that allows us to build skills and knowledge on top of it. We have different capacities for this trailer. Some people move through life with a smaller trailer, while others have large truck beds, giving them the ability to stack many different things on top of it. This ability tends to remain quite stable over time until we reach a certain age, when it starts to become more challenging for our brains. But, as mentioned, for most of our lives, our cognitive ability remains fairly constant. When we say that we measure future potential, it's tied to the fact that our capacity doesn't change much over time, as we just mentioned. That's why we can confidently say that we measure future potential. Logical tests are actually the only method that reliably provides insights about the future. Other recruitment methods only look at what we've done in the past, like a resume or an interview, or what we're doing today, like in a case study. One clear advantage of Core compared to our other logical test ACE is that Core is a more universal test. ACE works best for complex roles, whereas Core is more versatile and works well in a wide variety of roles. It can be used early on in the recruitment process, but you can also introduce it later in the process if that fits better. An important point today is that Core has been reviewed and approved by DMV in Norway. So it has undergone an independent review and a certification has been issued. All candidates receive the same questions, which is a difference from ACE as well, where the test adapts based on the candidate's answer. Core starts with the easier questions and gradually becomes more difficult. If a candidate were to take the test multiple times, they would notice that the answer options are shuffled, which is intended to make cheating more difficult. Having a time limit is also another way to make cheating more challenging. So we can say that we have a fairly AI-resistant test. When questions are text-based, they become easier for an AI such as ChatGPT or similar to handle. However, we see that AI struggles significantly more with figure-based questions. The best way to address the issue of cheating, which is actually quite rare, is to have candidates take the tests on site, for example, when meeting for an interview. Alternatively, you can have the candidate take the test while sharing their screen with you. which is feasible given that the average test time is 18 minutes. Moving on. The time limit is set to 35 minutes with an average completion time of 18 minutes. This means that many candidates will have time left after answering all the questions. It also ensures that most candidates will be able to finish the test, and this is intentional. The goal is to measure the candidate's maximum capacity. We don't want to take chances with that, so we've added a bit more time than usual, 35 minutes, to ensure that candidates really have the opportunity to answer as accurately as possible. As mentioned earlier, there are 19 matrix questions. This means that you will be presented with a set of geometric figures where you need to find a pattern or connection, and then choose from 5 options with one that fits into the pattern. When it comes to language and norm groups, the information can be found on our support page for core. You can find it at master.se, then click on Support EN, and then the core button, and you will find it there. One thing to keep in mind regarding language is that it's secondary for core, as there is no text in the actual questions. The only text appears before the test begins. This also makes the test well suited for individuals with dyslexia or dyscalculia. As for the norm groups, they help us understand the most commonly occurring level of logical reasoning in a given country. Our norm groups represent the population of the respective countries. So the same distribution of men, women, managers, chefs, academics, etc., as in, for example, the Swedish population. When choosing a norm group, the key factor is where the person will be working. So if I work in a German company in Stockholm, I use the Swedish norm group. And if it's a Swedish company in Berlin, I use the German norm group. We also have an international norm group, which can be used if no country-specific or region-specific norm is available yet, or in cases where one works extensively in an international setting. However, it's important to note that the candidate's score can vary depending on the norm group you select, so be careful when choosing the norm group. Now, regarding the scale itself, we use what's called the STEN scale, which stands for Standard 10. It's a 10-point scale that's intuitively easy to understand. It runs from 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. We will also be able to see how many questions the candidate has attempted to answer, and in most cases, candidates will have looked at all 19. If a candidate has answered very few questions, we should investigate whether they had any technical issues, and if that's the case, you can of course offer them a new test. Now let's talk about what we call the normal distribution, meaning how common a certain result is within a norm group. Here you can see our STEN scale, and we have 5 different types of gradations along the scale that shows the percentage of the norm group that has the corresponding results. A score of 1 to 2 indicates a low result, which 6% of the norm group has. A score of 3 to 5 is below average, with 24% falling into this category. The most common score is 5 or 6, where 40% of the norm group falls. Then as the score increases, they become less common again. So 7 to 8 is considered a high result, achieved by 24% of the norm group. And finally, very high results of 9 and 10 are achieved by 6% of the norm group. This means that 70% of any norm group will have a score between 4 and 7. This information will be included in the reports, and the results are described in a positive and concrete way. For example, for lower scores, you might see phrases indicating that the person has a greater aptitude for operational work rather than logical and problem-solving tasks. Now let's talk a bit about criteria and job analysis. This is, I would say, the key to core. If we don't know what we're looking for, we don't know when we found it. By focusing on what the role requires in terms of logical ability and developing a clear criteria, we create a more fair and humane recruitment process. When the complexity level of a role becomes too demanding, it often has a significant impact on the person holding the position. Therefore, developing a set of criteria and comparing candidates against it is just as important for the candidate's well-being as it is for the company's success. The criteria can be changed or added at any point in the process, either by you as the user or the recruiting manager. There are 3 ways to establish criteria. You can manually set the range directly in our system based on what feels right. You can use the generic criteria that we at Master have developed. These can be found on Core's support page. And you can fill out our core job analysis, which is the best and most reliable option. Criteria can be applied across all of our tools, and you can involve the recruiting manager in developing these criteria. Keep in mind that a good match level is considered to be 75% of the score or higher, as we've accounted for the slight standard error that exists in all measurement tools. Let's talk about what we call the core job analysis. This is an online guide that helps determine the minimum logical ability required for a role. There's also a section focusing on the impact of potential mistakes in the role. But the main focus is on the actual tasks involved and translating them into a score. It takes about 10 minutes to complete, and it's designed to be self-explanatory. You can find it through the core support page on our webpage or via the link that you see here. The guide is also available in several languages. Once you complete the guide, you'll receive a score that indicates the minimum logical ability required for the role. We refer to this score as the cutoff. You can then enter this information directly into our MPP system to establish the criteria. For example, if you get a cutoff score at 6, we recommend setting the range from 6 up to 10. However, if the cutoff score is very low, like 3 or 4, you might consider also setting a cutoff at the top, such as 7 or 8, to avoid the risk of a candidate with a very high logical ability becoming frustrated or demotivated if the role doesn't present enough logical challenges. Remember to consider the importance of logical ability when setting the criteria. If it's critical for the role, you should prioritize it as high. Criteria can be applied across all our tools and therefore can be used both independently and in combination with, for example, a personality test. You can also reuse previous criteria by importing them from old assessments into a new one. Here's what it looks like in the system when candidates have taken core. You can see this directly in the candidate list, which makes it easier when deciding on the next step. You can also see how to interpret the matching percentage. A match rate of 75 to 100% means that the candidate has the logical ability required for the role. A match rate of 46 up to 74% indicates a moderate match, with the quality decreasing the lower the percentage. A match rate below 45% represents a low match. Note that if you use 2 tests, the match percentage in the candidate list will be the combined match score. Depending on how important logical ability is compared to the other factors in the role, you'll need to assess how low a match that is acceptable. However, we generally advised against going below 45%, especially if the role is highly complex. Next, let's look at the reports and test interviews regarding core. First, consider whether a verbal feedback session on the test result is necessary. We recommend that candidates always receive the report immediately after completing the test, and this is often sufficient as feedback. However, if you still want to meet the candidate and conduct a test interview, here are some tips and advice. We have 4 types of reports for core: a score overview, a score report, an interview guide, and a question page. Let's start with a score overview. This is a 1-page report that can be used during in-person meetings with the candidates or shown digitally to provide a general summary of the results. It's also a useful report to share with managers who are familiar with using logical tests. At the top of the score overview report, you'll see the candidate score, followed by a brief description of the result. At the bottom, you also get an indication of how many people in the norm group that have achieved a similar result. It's a very simple and easy to understand report. However, note that this report does not include the criteria or match percentage. So it's important to focus the conversation with the manager on matching rather than the scores. Higher scores are not always better. It's more meaningful to discuss qualification levels or cutoff points and match percentages with the manager. The next report is the score report, which is suitable for candidates and also for less experienced managers. This report provides the score along with a brief analysis on the summary page. If you go further, you will find a more in-depth analysis covering areas like work performance and job-related learning. These analyses are, of course, score-specific. Now we come to our interview guide, which is the most comprehensive report. If you follow this structure, you'll have a very solid, structured, and in-depth conversation. Ideal for those who really want to dive deep into logical ability. As the name suggests, this report also includes specific interview questions based on the candidate score. So if you want to delegate this test interview to the recruiting manager, this is the right report. It's not intended for the candidate, primarily because it includes the match percentage. Lastly, we have a simple questions page, which shows the candidate's results along with a few score-specific questions. If you plan to conduct test interviews, we want to remind you of these key points to ensure a structured and pleasant conversation. If you are uncertain, we recommend using the interview guide. You can also watch the video that demonstrates how a test interview can be conducted. You'll find it on our core support page or on our YouTube channel. It's important to establish a good relationship with the candidate before you start discussing the results. It can be challenging for some to talk about their logical ability, so it's best not to read too much into the responses. Make sure to explain what type of interview you'll be conducting. Here's how you can present core in a structured way during a feedback session or interview. Start by explaining that core uses the STEN scale, Standard 10, a 10-point scale that is easy to understand, ranging from 1 to 10, where 10 is the highest. You can explain that core compares the candidate's performance to a norm group, and that their results are distributed according to a normal distribution. For example, most candidates will fall into the middle range, with 40% scoring between 5 and 6, while fewer candidates will score in the extremes of 1 to 2 or 9 to 10. This ensures a fair and consistent benchmark. Also mention that core complies with GDPR regulations, meaning that the candidate's data is stored securely, used only for the intended purpose, and they have a right to request deletion of their data at any time. Next, present the candidate's core score and read through the analysis provided. If you wish to include specific questions based on the score, this is the point where you can proceed. We recommend that you prepare this in advance, thinking through what might be strong versus weaker responses before meeting the candidate. It's also important to know that candidates might struggle to understand what logical ability entails. Therefore, even if they believe that they possess a higher level of logical ability, you'll ultimately need to trust the score from the test. Wrap up by presenting the next step in the process. If you are using a personality test as well, it's a good idea to provide feedback on those results at the same time. That's everything for today. On our support page, you'll find additional useful resources, such as a conversation checklist and the interview video I mentioned earlier. Feel free to contact us at master at +46 8 32 42 42 or support@master.se. Thank you for watching.